You're watching special coverage here on Arise News of a politically momentous day, Nigeria's 2023 presidential inauguration event. In the dawn of the day, a few hours after the sun rose over the stretch of Abuja known as Eagle Square and final preparations had been made, the new president of Nigeria, Bola Tinubu, was sworn in a ceremony attended by numerous heads of state and other foreign dignitaries. Mr. Tinubu, who served as governor of Lagos State, took over from his fellow APC party member, Muhammadu Buhari, who served the maximum 2 terms in office.
Indeed, opposition candidates are disputing the outcome of February's election, the election that brought Mr. Tinubu to power. So against that background and against all the other issues, now the new president or the new government faces a myriad of challenges, including crime, rising crime, political, ethnic, and religious divisions, violent extremism, poverty, and unemployment. What will be, or what should be, the issues to be tackled first?
That's a very good question. Well, people right across the country know how much is at stake from today with a new president that could change the course of Nigeria's future for better or for worse. Well, for greater insight, we're joined now in the studio by the noted Professor of Political Science, Professor Jibrin Ibrahim, who is also chair of the editorial board of Nigeria's Premium Times newspaper and senior fellow at the Center for Democracy and Development. Prof, thank you very much indeed for coming in.
A pleasure.
I wonder what you observed about today's ceremony and the messages that President Bola Tinubu pushed out. What stood out for you?
I think what stood out for me is that we've actually had 30 years of military rule in this country. The whole ceremony is so militarized, the formations, the drills, the regimental
flags. That's an interesting observation.
And as I was watching, what came to my mind is, well, how different was this when a new military regime takes over? But no, we can't spoil the day by talking about the military.
Absolutely.
I think what stood out for me was it was an inaugural speech that had a clear program for governance. And usually in an inaugural address, you want to reassure people, you want to tell them you are going to do good things for them, but often those making such addresses don't spell out what are those things you are proposing to place on the table. And I think President Tinubu was quite clear in bringing out the essence of his governance program right from day one. And that will set the debate, that will set the agenda for the coming weeks and months in terms of how much of that would happen. How would it happen? Was the attitude of Nigeria to these Nigerians to these programs? And he did make the important point that he's not going to rule, he's going to govern with the assent of the people, which means a feedback loop is going to be central to his governance style. I think it's a good beginning. I found the statement impressive. And it sets us along the path of engaging governance from day one, unlike in 2015, where governance didn't really start till after 5 to 6 months.
Interesting, but you know when you're talking about the parade, and I mean, he's not just the president, he's also the commander in the chief of the armed forces. Perhaps that's why we still have some of this parade you talk about and the reminiscence of...
It's a salutary reminder.
Yes, that he's the commander-in-chief. But I wanted to ask you, as you said about the statement hitting the right notes, it's a departure from I belong to no one and I belong to everybody, which was not clearly spelled throughout the 8 years of President Muhammadu Buhari, whether we like it or not. A lot of people said, there was a lot that was done wrongly. But listen to President Tinubu today. He says, I shall serve with prejudice toward none, but compassion and amity towards all. What did you think of that?
I think it reflected the general tenor of the speech, which is that it was well thought out and that it tries to cover what one could consider to be the absences of his predecessor. One of those absences or silences was empathy. The fact that the former president never really showed any understanding or empathy. We've never had as much violence as we had under his tenure. But then when those incidents occur, the sort of expectation in a normal country is that the president will immediately engage the issues, visit the victims, show some concern, and we had very, very little of that. I do hope that there's a signal that will change, and that governance in a democracy is really about what do the people want? What are the people saying? How are you going to address the demands from the people? Do you have the resources to address them? If you don't, what percentage can you address, and how do you engage them in a conversation about your position as somebody heading governance who knows what resources are available and what can be done and cannot be done, and the people's expectations? All those are important elements of communication that provides way for the president to show that he's not against the people, he's actually for the people, but that, like every other president, he's working within the constraints imposed by social and economic realities.
Yeah, that's a good point. And of course, we saw, I mean, Adesua was there at I don't know if you were there, if you watched it on television.
No, I watched it on telly.
Okay, as I did. But Adesua was right there in the thick of it. And we could see, a sea of international people there. I mean, there were heads of states, there were all kinds of dignitaries. And of course, on the international front, there's always been what you might call a permanent state of concern about Nigeria, and this fear that this country might just not hold together. Do you think that abiding sort of sentiment has deepened in the run-up to this inauguration, or has it abated, having heard the speech? I mean, I know that's a big thing to say, has it abated? But having heard the speech, the way that it impressed you and impressed a lot of other people, you think it might have struck a chord internationally?
I think the elections we just went through was a very difficult election for this country. It was very emotive. It divided the country right down the middle. There are lots of concerns. And that posed a lot of concerns, not just for the international community, but for Nigerians. And the comments I hear today is that everybody's hope is that there will be a focus on healing the wounds, on nation building. Now, to your substantive question about the impact of the speech in terms of these concerns over Nigeria, I think it will assuage nerves, but we all know that in politics, you can't really make any assessment after day one. It just shows you signals. And the first question about signals is that are they true signals? That is that the path that will be engaged in, or is it a decoy? Or is it simply political statements to reassure people while something else is in the background? I think what will really be important is what happens over the next 4 weeks. Everybody is concerned that we had an outgone president that never started governing till after about 6 months, acted as if he had all the time in the world. The appointments he made in his last week in office was more than he made in his first 6 months in office. And people should reflect about that and what it said about the attitude to governance. Would we now have a difference? That's the issue. And what will be the nature of that difference? Would it be a set of appointments where you can clearly see competence and where you can clearly see national representation in the choices that are made? These are the questions in people's minds. And the fact of the matter, today is for the speech, for the banquet, and for the dancing. And it's in the coming days that we'll begin to see how does this speech translate into concrete governance actions.
Indeed, after the pomp and the pageantry, Nigerians will wait to see what President Bola Tinubu can deliver. But I wanted to go back to the cloud of the disputed elections. And how much do you think that will shape the presidency as it sets, in motion? Today, he did say that we have endured hardships that would have made other societies crumble. That's I think, for me, another profound statement that came from the president today, to say the resilience of the Nigerian people, despite what you throw at them. But there's this cloud of a disputed election that brought him to power. How significant is that?
Well, you see, I think the cloud of disputed election is almost second nature to Nigerian elections. Go through all of them. There has been none without a cloud. From 1959, the suspicion of British manipulation. 1964, manipulation by the ruling Northern People's Congress, through to the entry of Shagari and how the then military head of state, Obasanjo, you can go through each one of them. So for this country, and as a political scientist, disputed election is the order of the day. The issue really is the process of going through the tribunals and the judicial system and accepting whatever decision comes out of that process. That's the first point. The second point is, will this governance style show an appreciation that certain things were done that were wrong, that were unacceptable, and a recognition for repairing, to the extent to which that is possible, some of those wrongs, the steps are undertaken. That's really what people are waiting for, hoping to see. And I think clearly in his speech, the president reached out to the opposition, accepted their right to contest results in court, and showed that the rule of law is something he takes seriously. But in addition, made a solemn promise that he will take action to address these fundamental or profound differences, identity issues that seriously affected the elections and hurt the minds of many Nigerians.
And I want to just return to the point you made earlier about signals that emerged from his speech today, signals to Nigerians, signals to the international community. One of the big takeaways, of course, the issue of fuel subsidy, which he said he was going to scrap. But of course, the cost of...
which he said he has scrapped.
He has scrapped, he said it's gone. But of course, the cost of living is so high for Nigerians at the moment. Inflation is, over 22%. So if you add expensive fuel to that, is it not likely to push people to the limit? And I'm wondering whether he did that, because we talked about signals to the international community, whether he did that as a signal to the international investors to show that he's serious about this economy.
I think he's always been clear that he feels fuel subsidy is no longer sustainable in this country. And all the economists I speak to tell me that it is indeed not sustainable. That fuel subsidy was part of our system because we had a high rent from petroleum. In the past 3-4 years, that petroleum rent has basically disappeared. And the economic reality today is that we actually have to borrow money to pay for fuel subsidy. And that doesn't make a lot of sense because we are accumulating debts, not just for ourselves, but for our children and grandchildren. Having said that, whether Nigerians will accept the removal of fuel subsidy is quite another question, because the government is making economic arguments. And in the last 50 years of struggle over fuel subsidy, Nigerians have not been making economic arguments. They've been making political arguments that those in power are enjoying the wealth. We, the people, need to enjoy something. And the only thing we can really enjoy is cheap fuel. So we don't care what the economics are. You must give us cheap fuel. So Nigerian citizens, for the most part, have a political attitude towards that. So it's difficult to convince people with an economic argument when they are making political arguments. And that's the problem he's going to have. Definitely the NLC and a lot of Nigerians will be very opposed to this move, not just because of the economic conditions, but because they are saying, this is a privilege we've had for 50 years, for heaven's sake. How can you be the president that will stop this enjoyment that we've had for all these decades? He's going to have a real problem about that, and he'll need to be able to frame arguments that convince Nigerians that the reality has shifted significantly from, say, 2012, when there was the massive uprising over this issue against President Jonathan, where the argument then was, and don't forget, there was a compact signed in 2012 between the Nigerian government and the Nigerian people. Yeah, you'll fix the 4 refineries, government should fix them, make sure you sell government fuel at a cheap level, and then you can talk about the issue of subsidy. Government has not met its own bargain in that regard, and President Buhari promised from day one he'll fix the refineries. We know the monies were paid, they were never fixed. So government, and Tinubu is inheriting this government, has a case to answer on the court of public opinion.
Interesting. But can President Tinubu talk about economic prosperity without having a more secured environment? How difficult a task will that be? And what should be, the priority? Governing Nigeria is no small, is a tall order. Sometimes I wonder why anybody vies for that job, but they do. He's asked for this job. He's gone through the elections. He's the president. But what should be the top priority, in your own opinion?
Well, I think the question of security, there's no debate about it. Everybody accepts that you can't really talk about improving economic productivity if you don't fix security. One of the issues over the past 5 to 10 years is that farmers in many parts of this country have difficulties even going to their farms. So you can say, fine, you'll provide fertilizers, you'll do this and this for farmers. If people are killing them on the way to the farm, that destroys any possibility. The fact that people feel so unsafe, and that businesses often confront difficulties relating to movements of goods and all that, all add up to the difficulties in fixing the economy. Security, we need a new paradigm. That's absolutely clear. I must say there's been some improvement over the past few months in terms of security provisioning. That improvement must be sustained. But I think over and above that, we have to get back to a situation where Nigeria is safe for people to run their livelihoods and run their businesses.
Right. Prof, I have to ask you this question because I feel that you're the person who is perhaps best positioned to answer it because of the scope and scale of your analytical capacity. Because at a transition point such as this, we're always forced to think back to the origins of this country. And in that context, one is reminded of a quote from a Nigerian monarch in the Niger Delta in 1896, who, after encountering the British, said, quote, "You came from the sky, you came from the moon, you came from the clouds, but it would be better if you just left us alone." And when you think about Nigeria, this huge country that's growing really fast with so many ethnic divisions, do you wonder if things would be better if we were just smaller, self-contained countries like you have in Europe or elsewhere in Africa?
Well, I've always wondered about that. And I will always give the citation of Ade Ajayi that it might be the case that Nigeria is too big and that there is some sense in creating smaller political communities. But the reality is this community called Nigeria exists. And there's absolutely no way, historically, culturally, socially, you can break it without causing more havoc than the havoc that already exists. And that therefore, the most rational way to proceed with the reality we have is to fix that reality. People used to think that it's easy to subdivide this country. But take the issue of dividing it ethnically. There's a huge debate whether we have 200 ethnic groups or 600 ethnic groups among sociologists and specialists in that field. So how are you going to start? And then there has been so much mixing. People underestimate some of the realities of this country. We have one of the rare constitutions in the world that advises citizens to intermarry along ethnic and religious lines. And you know what? Nigerians have been doing that for the past 70, 80 years. And that we are all implicated in mixed communities. That's the reality of our citizenship today. So going back to smaller communities is good nostalgia, but impossible politics.
Prof, I want to thank you very much indeed. It's always extremely enlightening talking with you. And Professor Jibrin Ibrahim is a noted professor of political science. He's also chair of the editorial board of Nigeria's Premium Times newspaper and senior fellow at the Center for Democracy and Development. Thank you very much indeed.
It's a pleasure.